There was a moment, I remember it clearly, when I was lying in my bed in the middle of the afternoon, unable to move, unable to pray, barely able to breathe without pain, and I realized that the house around me was completely quiet, not peaceful quiet, empty quiet, the kind of quiet that tells you something without saying a word. My family was there, my community was nearby. And yet, I have never in my life felt more alone than I did in that moment. That feeling, that terrifying, hollow feeling of being surrounded by people and still being invisible, is what I am going to tell you about today. Because I almost lost myself to it. And the person who pulled me back was not someone from my church, not a neighbor, not a family member. It was an English doctor I had only known for a few weeks, and to this day, I still ask myself how that was possible. I grew up in a tight Amish community in rural Pennsylvania, and from the very beginning of my life, I was taught that community is everything, that you do not face hardship alone, that when one person suffers, the whole community surrounds them. I believed that with my whole heart. I had seen it happen. I had been part of it myself. When our neighbor Emma broke her hip one winter, I was there every morning for 6 weeks bringing food and helping with her children. When the Yoder family lost their barn to a fire, I spent 3 days cooking for the men who came to rebuild it. Giving was not something I thought about. It was simply who I was. And because I gave that way, I never once imagined that when my own time of need came, it would feel like the giving had been forgotten. My life before the illness was full in a way that I genuinely loved. I was married, I had a home to care for, a garden that I tended, and a place in the community that felt solid and meaningful. I was the woman people called on. I was the one who remembered who needed a meal, who remembered which family was struggling, who showed up without being asked. My husband Jonas was a quiet man, steady and hardworking, and we had a comfortable life together. Not fancy, not dramatic, just good and honest and real. I was happy. I want to say that plainly because what happened afterward can only be understood if you know that I had no reason to expect any of it. The first sign that something was wrong was a tiredness I could not explain. Not the tiredness that comes from hard work, because I knew that feeling well and even loved it a little. This was different. This was a tiredness that sat inside my bones. I would wake up in the morning already exhausted. I would try to hang laundry and have to stop and sit on the ground because my legs would simply stop cooperating. I told myself it would pass. Jonas told me to rest more. My mother said I was probably doing too much, which I suppose she meant kindly. But the weeks passed and it did not get better. It got worse, slowly and steadily, in a way that scared me more than a sudden crisis would have. Because a slow decline is harder to point to, harder to explain, harder to make people understand. By the time the pain started, I had already begun to withdraw from things I loved. I stopped going to quilting circle because the ride was too long and left me shaking. I stopped helping at community meals because standing for more than 20 minutes made my vision blur. I was watching my own life shrink, a little more each week, and I did not know why. And here is the first thing I want you to understand about loneliness. It does not always come from people leaving you. Sometimes it comes from you becoming someone they do not quite recognize anymore, and neither do you. My bishop suggested that I pray more. My sister-in-law told me that some women struggle with weakness of spirit, and that perhaps I needed to find my purpose again. Jonas never said anything unkind, but I watched him grow quieter and more distant as the months went on, as if my illness were a problem he did not know how to fix, and so he chose not to look at it directly. None of these people were cruel. I want to be very honest about that. They were doing what they knew. But when you are lying in pain at 2 in the morning and you cannot explain why your body is failing you, good intentions do not keep you warm. And I began to feel, slowly and then all at once, like I was disappearing. It was Jonas who finally arranged for me to see a doctor in the nearest town. He did not want to, not because he did not care, but because it felt like an admission that whatever was happening to me was beyond what faith alone could handle. I understood that. I had felt the same way, but by then I could barely walk to the end of our lane, and even Jonas could see that something was genuinely wrong. So on a cold Tuesday morning, he drove me into town, sat with me in the waiting room for about 15 minutes, and then said he needed to get back for the afternoon milking. And just like that, I was sitting alone in a fluorescent lit room full of strangers, waiting to find out what was happening inside my own body. Dr. Callahan came in carrying my file and a cup of coffee, and he set the coffee down on the counter and just looked at me for a moment before he said anything. Not in a strange way. In a way that felt like he was actually seeing me. He asked me to tell him in my own words what I had been experiencing, and he did not interrupt me once. I talked for almost 15 minutes. I told him about the exhaustion and the pain and the blurring vision and the way my hands sometimes shook so badly I could not hold a spoon. And when I finished, he did not immediately look at his clipboard or start writing. He said, "That sounds incredibly hard to carry alone." And I burst into tears right there in that little examination room, which embarrassed me terribly, but he just handed me a tissue and waited until I was ready to continue. Over the following weeks, as he ran tests and worked toward a diagnosis, something unexpected began to happen. I started looking forward to those appointments in a way that had nothing to do with the medical results. Because every time I sat down across from Dr. Callahan, he asked me how I was really doing. Not just physically, he wanted to know if I was sleeping, if I had people around me who were helping, if I felt frightened. And I was honest with him in ways I had not been honest with anyone in months, maybe years. I told him about the loneliness. I told him about feeling invisible. I told him how strange it was to have spent my whole life caring for others and then to find that when I needed care, I did not quite know how to receive it or even how to ask for it. He listened to all of it, every word. The diagnosis came on a gray Thursday afternoon. It was a chronic autoimmune condition, serious but manageable with the right treatment. Not a death sentence, but not something that would simply go away either. I would have to learn to live differently. I would have to accept limitations I had never imagined having. And something about hearing it said out loud, having it named and made real, broke something open inside me. I drove home that day in the buggy alone, and I let myself feel every emotion I had been pushing down for months. Fear, grief, anger, and underneath all of it, a strange and fragile gratitude for the man who had finally helped me understand what I was dealing with. It was around this time that I learned something about Dr. Callahan that changed how I understood his kindness. One of the nurses mentioned quietly that he had lost his wife to an autoimmune disease several years earlier, that he had watched her struggle to get a diagnosis for nearly 2 years before anyone took her seriously, that ever since then he had made it his mission to make sure his patients did not feel unseen the way she had. When I heard that, I sat with it for a long time, because suddenly his gentleness had a history, his patience had a reason, and I realized that sometimes the people who help us most are carrying their own grief right alongside ours. But here is where the story gets complicated. Because as Dr. Callahan's care continued to feel like the steadiest thing in my life, I started to feel something I did not expect and did not know how to name. Not romantic, I want to be clear about that, but an emotional attachment that felt dangerously strong for a married woman in my community. I started to notice when the week stretched long before my next appointment. I started replaying conversations in my head. I started thinking, he understands me more than my own husband does, and that thought frightened me more than any diagnosis ever could, because I knew it was partly true. And I knew it was partly the distortion of a woman who had been starving for emotional connection and finally found a source of it. And then the setback came that nearly broke me entirely. I arrived for what I thought was a routine appointment and was told that Dr. Callahan had taken a leave of absence for personal reasons. No details, no timeline, just a different doctor waiting in the room and a file that had been passed along without any of the context that made me feel known. I sat through that appointment in a complete fog, answering questions, nodding when I should, and then I went home and did not get out of bed for 2 days. Jonas thought it was the illness flaring. He was not wrong. But it was also grief. The grief of losing the one voice that had made me feel real when everything else in my life was making me feel like a burden. Those 2 days in bed were the turning point, though I did not know it yet, Because lying there in that silence, I finally started having an honest conversation, not with a doctor, not with my community, but with myself. I asked myself what I had actually been looking for all those months, and the answer was simple and humbling and a little heartbreaking. I had been looking for someone to witness my suffering without flinching. I had been looking for permission to not be strong. I had been looking for proof that I still mattered even when I could not do anything for anyone, and Dr. Callahan had given me that. But so, I realized slowly, had other people in smaller and less visible ways. Jonas, who quietly moved my chair closer to the fire every evening without my asking. My daughter, who started leaving wildflowers on the windowsill beside my bed. My old friend Ruth, who stopped visiting for a while but then reappeared one afternoon and just sat with me in silence for an hour, which turned out to be exactly right. I had not been entirely abandoned. I had been too desperate to see the smaller kindnesses. And Dr. Callahan's care had felt so large, partly because he was trained to give it, and partly because I had let my hunger for connection make one person carry the weight of everyone. Dr. Callahan came back after about 3 weeks. Our first appointment after his return was quiet and careful, and I told him honestly that his absence had been harder for me than I expected, and that I had spent some time thinking about why. He was thoughtful about it. He said that patients who have been through prolonged isolation often form strong attachments to the first person who truly listens, and that this was not weakness, it was evidence of how much connection mattered and how much I had been missing it. He encouraged me to let the people around me try again, to ask for what I needed instead of waiting to see if they would figure it out, and to remember that healing was not just physical, it never is. I have been living with my diagnosis for almost 2 years now. I am not cured, but I am better. I have learned to pace myself, to ask for help without shame, and to receive care from the people who love me in the imperfect ways they know how to give it. Jonas and I have had some of the most honest conversations of our marriage. My community has shown up in ways I did not expect once I stopped pretending I was fine. And I still see Dr. Callahan for regular appointments, and I am grateful for him in a way that is clean and clear and grounded now rather than desperate. He gave me something I did not know I needed. He showed me what it felt like to be truly heard. And that lesson did not stay in his examination room. It came home with me and changed the way I listened to everyone around me. Here is what I know now that I did not know before any of this happened. The people who save us do not always look like we imagined they would. Sometimes salvation comes in the form of a quiet English doctor with a cup of coffee and the patience to let you finish your sentence. And sometimes the loneliness we feel is real, but it is also, at least in part, a message from our own heart that we have been giving so much of ourselves to others that we forgot to let anyone give back to us. Suffering has a way of teaching you exactly that. It strips away everything you thought defined you and forces you to figure out who you are when you cannot do anything for anyone. And what I found, underneath all that fear and pain and exhaustion, was a woman who deserved care, just as much as anyone I had ever helped. That was the hardest lesson, and the most important one. If you have ever been through a season like this, a time when you felt invisible, when the one person who truly saw you came from somewhere you never expected, I want to hear from you. Leave your story in the comments below, because stories like these deserve to be shared and witnessed just the way I needed to be witnessed when I was at my lowest. And if this story touched something in you, please share it with someone who might need to hear it today, because sometimes the most healing thing we can do for another person is simply make them feel a little less alone.